All right, here's the lowdown on the similarities between ISL and Dot1Q, and you're seeing it actually just at the top of your screen. They're both trunking protocols, and they are both point-to-point protocols with a switch at each endpoint. That's really it as far as the similarities go. Now for those differences. First, ISL is Cisco proprietary, and that means, of course, that only Cisco switches even understand ISL. You cannot use ISL in a multi-vendor switching environment. Frankly, even though that sounds really bad, it's the least of our concerns with using ISL. And here, upcoming, is the most of our concerns. ISL is going to encapsulate every single frame that goes across that trunk. And of course, with encapsulation, we're putting a header on it and we're putting a trailer on it. It's called double tagging. Now that doesn't sound like such a big deal, and it's one of these things where on an individual basis with one frame, it's not. But it's the cumulative effect of lots of frames going across the trunk. And look at the extra workload that we get with that, because it's easy to say, oh, well, it's extra workload for the sending switch, but it's also an extra workload for the receiving switch. Because while the sender has to encapsulate every single frame, the recipient, the receiving switch, has to de-encapsulate every single frame. So there's a time loss in there, there's a little extra workload for the CPU, and then on top of that, we're actually using more bandwidth because the frames are bigger themselves. So there's a lot of extra work going on there with that double tagging. Now, everything we do, of course, on that Cisco switch has a cost in terms of time and effort. And that's one reason you don't see a whole lot of ISL anymore. But believe it or not, there's actually even more to dislike regarding ISL. Now, we know the native VLAN is the default VLAN. And we're going to see in the very next video here in this section of the course how we change that, why we might want to change it, and why it's so important. But it's a vital concept. And the reason I bring that up now is that ISL doesn't even understand that concept. It does not recognize the concept of the native VLAN. And again, in a few minutes, we're going to see why that is so important. Now, the total overhead with ISL, what we're doing there, or what ISL is doing, I should say, it's a total overhead of 30 bytes. 26 bytes of that is going to be in the header, which includes, among other values, the VLAN ID. And the 4-byte trailer contains a CRC value, the cyclic redundancy check. And the CRC, it's a frame validity scheme. I'm sure you ran into that in your CCNA studies. It allows the recipient of the frame to test the frame's integrity, make sure that it didn't get corrupt during the transmission process. So there's some important info in there, but that's a lot of overhead, especially when it gets compared to IEEE 802.1Q, which thankfully we just refer to as Dot1Q. That results in much less overhead. Using Dot1Q, that is, results in much less overhead being placed on our frames. And in turn, what does that do? It lessens the workload on the sending switch, it lessens the workload on the receiving switch, and it saves a little bit of bandwidth. Because Dot1Q only places a 4-byte header on each frame. It's actually a tag that gets inserted into the frame. And even better, so it's a 4-byte overhead max. But even better than that is that if the frame is destined for the native VLAN, even that little bit of header isn't put on the frame. Because when the recipient switch sees a frame come in that has no tag, has no VLAN ID, it says, oh, okay, I'm going to make the assumption, since we're running Dot1Q, that the native VLAN is indeed the destination VLAN, which is just one good reason to make sure that your switches agree on the native VLAN. And in the next video, boy, are you going to see another one. Here are a few more Dot1Q tidbits for you. Dot1Q does embed that tagging information, as I mentioned, into the frame itself. And for that reason, you will occasionally hear it referred to as internal tagging. Dot1Q is the industry standard trunking protocol, which makes it suitable for use in a multi-vendor switching environment. We know if we've got two protocols like this, one has to be industry standard, one is probably going to be Cisco proprietary, and here Dot1Q is our industry standard, and ISL is Cisco proprietary. Since Dot1Q adds only one tag, it's often referred to as single tagging. And just a quick reminder with that 4-byte addition, because ISL, of course, has that 26-byte header, but both ISL and Dot1Q bring a 4-byte addition to the frame, but they are in different locations. ISL's 4-byte trailer, hey, it's just that, it's a trailer, it goes on the end of the frame. Dot1Q's 4-byte addition is in the form of a tag inserted into the frame. Now, when it comes to access ports, do we even really need a VLAN ID? We don't, and that's why the switch has nothing. The switch is never going to tag frames that have anything to do with access ports, because an access port, as we know, belongs to one and only one VLAN, so there's no real need for the VLAN to be identified. Now, about that native VLAN, this is a new lab coming up, and it's going to be a little longer, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this recording at this point, and in the next video, we will talk about why we might want to change the native VLAN. I'll show you an illustration of a lab, or of the lab we're going to do, that would necessitate, or maybe make it a really good idea, I should say, to change that native VLAN, and then we'll actually do it on the live equipment and see some messages that might scare you the first time you see them, which is why I want you to see them here. See you on the next video.